Welcome to the Season 2 finale of You're All Doomed, where we snare-trapped and window-crashed our way through Friday the 13th Part 2, 13 minutes at a time. I'm your host, Brian.
I'm Greg.
And today we are going to just wrap this movie up with a special bonus episode. We're just going to talk about some things that we didn't talk about in the earlier episodes.
So the first thing I did after finishing watching it this time was to look back at some of the response to the movie at the time, specifically from notable film critic Roger Ebert, who was on record as very strongly disliking the first movie. So I looked up a copy of his 2000 book, I Hated This Movie, which is a collection of reviews of movies that he particularly disliked. And this movie was in there. He gave it half a star. But the review is a little bit unfair in the sense that it's clear that this kind of movie is just not his cup of tea. Fair enough. I mean, I respect his opinion on a lot of things, and if this isn't your bag, no pun intended, I get it. Like, that's fine. But if you're not on board with what the movie is going to be, then it's not necessarily the right frame of mind to question whether or not it was effective. That response is more questioning whether the movie should exist in the first place, and that's a whole separate debate. The bottom line is the movie does exist, and the question from a critical standpoint is how effective is it at what it's trying to do? And if its main goal is to make me feel creeped out and afraid to go into the woods at night, then it did its job magnificently. So I get that Ebert was no fan of just being a body count movie where thinly sketched characters are knocked off one by one, like a cheap Agatha Christie novel or something. But for what I went in wanting from this movie, I got exactly what I was hoping for. This is my favorite of the series.
I was going to say the same exact thing.
And I love it. So this is kind of the reason I really dig these movies.
It's genuinely scary. It's arguably the scariest of the entire franchise, and I think that's why I like it. But there's also just some great characters in here. It's not just stupid people doing stupid things that deserve to get hacked to pieces. Mm-hmm. There's people that have carefully thought out plans, and they try to humanize Jason, which you're really never going to see again. And there's great acting, and I just think it's a really well structured slasher flick, and it's a great kind of blueprint. If you want to make a good slasher flick, I think this is one to follow. And sure, you can argue, that Halloween before it was the one to follow, and and this could be a ripoff of that. But I think this is just kind of a great example of just twisting the genre on its edge a little bit and coming up with something a little bit different. And it's a pretty bold sequel because it doesn't have, it doesn't even have the same killer from the first one. Mm-hmm. So the fact that they pulled it off, I've always just really enjoyed this movie. Yeah,
and I mean, I know that, as we kind of touched on, Sean Cunningham never intended for Jason to be a central figure in this mythos. He kind of treated Jason's reappearance at the end of the first movie as almost like a gag and not real, and not something that would spawn sequels in this fashion. But I think it was an interesting choice to proceed with Part 2 without Sean Cunningham's input, make Jason the killer, and I mean, what started Jason on the road to becoming the icon that he is. I mean, without this movie, you wouldn't have Jason Voorhees being, a headliner in slasher movie, horror movie franchise films. So, they I don't know if they knew what they were doing or if they lucked into it, but it was the right call. And, Jason is the reason I come back and watch these movies over and over again. Although it's interesting that, somewhere along the line, as we'll get to, the scale tips and the audience begins to root for Jason. And to your point earlier, this is before that happens. Like, he's still a figure of fear and terror, and this movie takes that concept and goes to town with it. This was not the first of the movies that I saw. I actually saw Part 4. That was the first Friday the 13th movie I saw in its entirety. but this one is the one that I remember best for watching in my parents' basement with you, and my dad snuck downstairs and popped up on this. You were sitting on the sofa, and my dad popped up 2 feet from your face, and rah, and scared the bejesus out of us.
I'll never forget that, nor will I ever forgive him for it. It was not cool, but well done on his part.
Yeah, I mean, we were probably 12, 13 years old.
Probably, yep.
And, my parents' basement at night with the big glass doors was scary enough. And I don't know how he did it, but he managed to creep down there like a ninja. And he pulled that one off beautifully. And I hope he remembers, because I can picture him laughing about that even now if he does. From a behind-the-scenes perspective, it sounds like it was, a tough shoot, but fun. A lot of nights, obviously. The crew and the cast all seemed to get along pretty well. No major drama that was reported in any of the sources that I saw beyond the controversy of who gets credited as Jason. Interestingly, it sounds like the MPAA went to town on censoring the violence in this movie because they felt that the first movie's gore had kind of snuck by them in a way. Or had maybe shouldn't have been cleared to be as graphic as it was, and so they clamped down on this movie a little bit. And apparently there are 54 seconds of gory effects that were cut, according to Crystal Lake Memories, and that's a pretty staggering amount of screen time if you stop and think about it.
Yeah,
I would really love to know, exactly what was cut. I know a substantial portion of the impaling of Jeff and Sandra in bed was a major part of that, but I can't imagine that was a whole 54 seconds.
Plus it's also, I don't know what the parameters that, the MPAA operates under in terms of what they just determine is gross. I mean, it doesn't,
I think it shifts day to day.
Yeah. So it could be something like, I remember seeing something about, we see puddles of blood spilling on the floor and they cut that. Like, okay, if you think that's, too graphic, then we have a differing opinion. But, that does seem like a lot of footage that they cut out, and it'd be interesting to see just how tame it is by today's comparisons. As far as filming details are concerned, filming took place in August of 1980. And it was released in May 1st of 1981, which was less than a year after the first Friday the 13th movie came out, which is crazy to imagine. There was a time where you would watch a movie and then the sequel would be out less than a year later. That's insane. These days you have to wait, at least a few years for the next Marvel movie or whatever. But they were just, decided they were going to capitalize on the popularity of the first one and just crank this out as quickly as possible. The budget was $1.2 million approximately, compared to the first movie's budget, which was about $700,000. And I think you see it in this one. You see some, more creative killings. The location, I think, is more interesting than the first Camp Crystal Lake. So they use that money wisely. Opening weekend, it made $6.4 million compared to Friday the 13th, 5.8. So not a ton more, but it was still doing a little bit better. And then overall, the U.S. gross, it made a total of $21 million, but Friday the 13th made 39.7.
So it dropped off quickly.
Yeah,
afterwards.
that's a pretty big hit.
It had some pretty stiff competition in 1981, though. There are some pretty noteworthy movies that came out that same year. Halloween 2, actually, another horror sequel came out that year, which, I remember the poster for that flick. It's a pretty scary-looking pumpkin skull thing that stuck in my head even as a little kid. Along the lines of John Carpenter movies, that's the year he released Escape from New York, which is a fan favorite. Another great horror movie that came out that year was Evil Dead by Sam Raimi, with Bruce Campbell as the star, and that's gone on to create quite a fan following of its own. Relevant to this series, The Road Warrior was released in America in 1981. We'll touch on that a little bit next season for reasons that will be discussed. But the biggest movie from my perspective, another Paramount flick, Raiders of the Lost Ark, came out the summer of 1981. And that I remember seeing in the theater. It took me a couple years for me to see this one. It was on home video and cable by that point. But yeah, it was a pretty great year for movies.
Yeah, I think On Golden Pond was number 2, and Superman 2 was number 3 in the box office. Friday the 13th Part 2 ended up finishing 35 in the ranking. And you'd mentioned, Halloween 2 and Escape from New York. Both of those finished above. But it did narrowly beat out Omen 3, The Final Conflict, which I never knew was a thing. And most importantly, it took down 2 early Sylvester Stallone movies, Nighthawks and Victory, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah. Well, Nighthawks is a pretty good flick.
I know you love that movie.
Yeah, Rutger Hauer's in that movie.
And how can you not love Victory, a movie where the, soldiers or the POWs have to play a game of soccer to be freed?
Isn't Pele in that movie?
I think he is,
wow.
Yeah.
I will say one disappointing aspect of this sequel was the poster. We talked about the poster for the first movie at length last season because it was so great. And this one was a little bit of a cop-out. It's basically the same outlined silhouette of a sinister killer. This time it's holding a bloody axe instead of a knife. But the inside of the outline, whereas the first time it was a lavishly illustrated scene of the counselors in a moonlit camp, this is just the black poster with the title floating in the center of this figure. So I mean, it looks like it took 10 minutes to put together. Maybe some design work was put into it that I don't know about, but they just kind of made the part 2 look a little bit bloody, and they put a tagline that says the body count continues, and it's just not very inspired. It looks like it makes it look like it's even more of a ripoff of the first movie than I think it's fair to say the movie wound up being. So I wonder if that that probably didn't get the critical response to this flick off on the right foot from the get-go.
Yeah, the movie also had some strange taglines, which most do not make sense, or they're just not very effective. One of them is 2 times the fear, 2 times the carnage, 2 times the terror. Kind of lame. This one doesn't make any sense. 1 year ago today, 12 of her friends were violently murdered. Why should the first anniversary be any different?
But wait, what?
Right, because we established that it wasn't a year after Alice's friends were killed. It was 2 months, right?
Did the advertising copywriter even watch the movie?
I don't think so. Next one is pretty lazy. The body count continues. This one is also pretty lazy and rips off Jaws just when you thought it was safe to go back to camp. And the last one was the day you count on for terror is not over.
That's not bad.
It's not bad, but it's also not entirely accurate because they're making it seem like it's just one day where everything goes wrong. It just happens to be the same date.
And there's no indication in this movie that it takes place on Friday the 13th.
Right. The trailer is also worth noting because in the trailer for the first movie, it had this very comical counting up of all the victims, and the whole point was to get to the number 13, and it was just it just seemed like it took forever to get to the number 13, and they would show all these different clips from the movie. But the trailer for part 2 is really questionable because they show all of the kills. And so you see everyone die in the movie, but there's also some inaccurate ones. Like they show Ginny being cornered in the bathroom, toward the end of the movie, and they count that as one of the kills. But this time, instead of counting from 0 to 13, they count from 14 up. And again, it's just kind of like painfully awkward.
Well, even though it's my favorite of the series, I don't have anything else to talk about now. Do you, Brian?
No, I don't think so. I mean, we've done a pretty comprehensive job of going through this, but I think we've covered everything that I wanted to get to.
All right. Well, thank you again, everyone, for listening to this season and for sitting through Friday the 13th Part 2 with us. Join us in the future for Friday the 13th Part 3. And until then, I've been Greg.
And I've been Brian.
And you have been all doomed.
You're all doomed.